On a late afternoon in the Taiwan Strait, silence suddenly turned into alarm. Radars lit up, warning sirens echoed across the decks, and steel hulls moved with dangerous intent. Within seconds, a quiet patrol became a deadly game at sea. Yet what unfolded was not an accident of navigation, but a deliberate move in a much larger struggle. Let's find out with Navy Elite. On September 12, 2025, at exactly 3:42 p.m., a quiet afternoon in the Taiwan Strait turned into one of the tensest moments of the year. The USS Higgins, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, was conducting a freedom of navigation patrol, a legal operation designed to underscore the principle that no state can close international waters. For most of the patrol, the sea remained calm, but in seconds, the picture changed. A Chinese Type 052 D Luoyang 3 destroyer, instead of holding a parallel track, suddenly swung its bow toward the American vessel. It was not a slight shift in heading, it was a direct intercept, a maneuver that erased any margin for error. This move transformed routine presence into a crisis. At a distance of just a few nautical miles, steel warships displacing thousands of tons began closing in on each other at high speed. For naval crews, such a situation is not an exercise. It is a countdown where even a single wrong assumption could bring about a collision. In the Taiwan Strait, one of the most politically charged waterways in Asia, the risk of impact extended beyond physical. It carried the possibility of diplomatic rupture and military escalation between two superpowers. The USS Higgins remained steady on its assigned course, but every sailor on board knew the danger. The Combat Information Center monitored the approach using the SPY-6 radar, a system capable of tracking heading, acceleration, and angle with unmatched precision. The numbers on the screen told the story clearly. The Chinese destroyer was not shadowing, it was advancing, closing the gap at more than 25 knots. At that speed, the ships were only minutes away from a possible strike. Tension spread through the decks. Standard protocols went into effect. Log entries were marked with exact time and position, radar frames were saved, and every sound in the command room was recorded. These measures were not bureaucracy, they were insurance. If the event became an international incident, proof would matter as much as presence. Still, beyond all the data, one detail alarmed the crew the most: silence. The Chinese ship broadcast no message, sent no signal, and made no contact. In the world of naval operations, silence is rarely neutral. Here, it meant defiance, a challenge without words. The location itself added weight to the standoff. The Taiwan Strait is not just a busy sea lane. It is the very fault line of Asia's most dangerous geopolitical rivalry. Only a short distance from Taiwan's shores and less than 20 nautical miles from disputed baselines, this waterway has seen repeated close encounters in recent years. Yet few had reached the level of tension now unfolding. With both ships within visual distance, every sailor could sense that they were part of more than seamanship. They were part of a test designed to measure political will as much as naval skill. This was no simple meeting at sea. It was the start of a high-stakes game where silence, speed, and steel became the language of power. But instead of dialogue, both sides chose dangerous silence, pushing the confrontation toward its next stage. When the Chinese destroyer closed its bow toward the USS Higgins, the American crew did what international law requires. They tried to communicate. The bridge first broadcast a warning in English, the standard language of the sea. The message was clear, calm, and firm. Identify yourself and alter course. When no answer came, the officers tried again, this time in Mandarin, giving Beijing sailors no excuse for misunderstanding. Yet the radio waves carried back nothing but static. The silence was not confusion, it was deliberate. In naval terms, refusal to respond is not a small gesture. It is often a calculated signal. By ignoring calls, the Chinese ship turned the encounter into a test of nerves. For the Higginses, the situation grew sharper by the minute. Radar data from the SPY-6 system confirmed acceleration. speed rising above 25 knots, nearly 29 miles per hour, in a 7,500-ton warship loaded with missiles and guns. At such a velocity, distance collapses fast. Within moments, the closest point of approach shrank below 200 yards. For comparison, that is less than the length of 2 football fields between steel hulls that cannot stop quickly. At sea, this is already inside the danger zone. The Combat Information Center did not waste a second. Every second of radar feed was frozen and logged. Voice records, timestamps, and bearing angles were stored in multiple formats. On the bridge, lookouts tracked the destroyer through binoculars while officers repeated the radio challenge. Still, there was no reply. Only the steady growl of engines and the unmistakable closing vector. The crew understood what the silence meant. It was defiance. China was not only shadowing, it was pressing to see how far the United States would yield. The weight of this moment did not lie in weapons yet, but in perception. A 052D destroyer carries HHQ-9 surface-to-air missiles, YJ-18 anti-ship weapons, and a 130mm deck gun. Even without firing, the hull itself represented power. By remaining silent, the Chinese captain forced the Americans into a dilemma. Either change course to avoid collision, which could be perceived as a sign of weakness, or hold steady and risk escalation. Both choices carried consequences beyond the sea. For Washington, backing down under pressure would encourage further gray zone tactics. For Beijing, pushing too hard might trigger a clash that neither side wants to acknowledge publicly. Inside the Higgins, discipline never cracked. Orders were given in measured voices, with no panic or raised tone. Sailors held positions, engineers kept engines steady, and watch officers cross-checked every number. The atmosphere was tense but professional, for they knew the world often learns of great power struggles not from gunfire, but from these silent encounters where one side dares the other to blink. In that silence, the challenge was unmistakable. Beijing was testing limits, and the Higgins was writing down every second of proof. And to answer that defiance, the American destroyer soon sent its own unmistakable signals of deterrence. The Chinese Type 052D destroyer, also known as the Luoyang 3 class, is not an ordinary surface ship. It is the backbone of the People's Liberation Army Navy, equipped with a suite of advanced weapons designed for both defense and offense. Its vertical launch cells can fire HHQ-9 surface-to-air missiles, capable of striking aircraft or cruise missiles at long range. It also carries the YJ-18 anti-ship missile, a weapon designed to travel at subsonic speed before accelerating to supersonic velocity in the final stage, giving adversaries little reaction time. On the deck, a 130mm HPJ-38 naval gun sits ready for surface and shore bombardment, while its radar suite provides real-time tracking of multiple targets. At close distance, such a ship is not just a presence, it is a direct and credible threat. Despite this arsenal, the USS Higgins did not change course. The American destroyer, part of the Arleigh Burke class, maintained steady speed and heading. For the crew, yielding ground in international waters would send the wrong message, not only to Beijing but also to allies across the region. The ship's mission was to ensure freedom of navigation, and backing down would undermine Washington's long-standing commitment to keeping sea lanes open. Holding course was a form of deterrence in itself, demonstrating confidence in both the ship's technology and the rules that govern the sea. Yet, deterrence is not only about staying steady, it is also about maintaining a strong posture. On the Higgins, the Mark 45 5-inch gun was slowly trained toward the approaching Chinese vessel. No shells were loaded, and no fire commands were given. But the visible movement of the gun turret was unmistakable. It was a message written in steel. The American destroyer was not defenseless, and any aggressive step would be met with force. Naval strategy often relies on signals rather than shots, and here, the signal was crystal clear. At the same time, the electronic battle was already underway. The Higgins activated its SLQ-32V7 electronic warfare suite, a system built to analyze and counter hostile radar emissions. Within moments, the operators detected a narrowband surface search signal emanating from the Chinese destroyer. The data confirmed that Beijing's ship was not passively watching. Its radar was locked onto the Higgins, pulse width and frequency showing it was targeting rather than scanning. In electronic warfare, this is the difference between a glance and a stare. And a stare at combat distance is not accidental. It is preparation. For the Americans, the significance was twofold. First, it created legal and operational proof that the Chinese destroyer escalated the encounter by initiating a target lock. Second, it allowed the Higgins to calibrate countermeasures if the situation worsened. Every electronic signature was stored, time-stamped, and relayed to higher command. The U.S. Navy's doctrine emphasizes documentation because every recorded detail becomes evidence in the diplomatic and strategic struggle that follows these gray zone incidents. In that tense moment, both ships were mirrors of each other. Hulls of steel, sensors glowing, weapons pointed but not fired. It was a standoff without smoke or fire, but the risk was no less real. One wrong step could turn signals into salvos. But the confrontation did not stay limited to surface signals, because the United States soon unveiled its next strategic move from the sky. At exactly 3:45 p.m., the hum of rotor blades broke the heavy silence as an MH-60R Seahawk lifted off from the aft deck of the USS Higgins. This helicopter, a key asset of the U.S. Navy, did not carry missiles or torpedoes for this mission. Its role was not to attack, but to observe, and that made it just as powerful in this tense encounter. With its advanced sensors and cameras, the Seahawk became the eye in the sky, providing the Higgins with a new layer of awareness in situations where every detail mattered. The Seahawk climbed to about 200 feet, circling slowly above the destroyer. Its forward-looking infrared system began scanning the Chinese Type 052D destroyer, capturing high-resolution video and thermal images. Every movement on the deck, every heat signature from radar equipment, and even the positioning of crew members were recorded in real time. For Washington, this was more than surveillance, it was evidence collection. The data could later be used in diplomatic channels or international forums to prove that the Chinese warship had engaged in unsafe maneuvers. On the deck of the Chinese vessel, details stood out through the Seahawk's lenses. The 130mm H/PJ-38 naval gun was uncovered, and two sailors were positioned close to it, standing watch but not actively operating the weapon. Other sensors locked onto the radar mounts, capturing the emission patterns as the destroyer systems continued to scan the Higgins. These recordings were geotagged and time-stamped, ensuring they could withstand scrutiny if Beijing denied what had happened. In essence, the helicopter transformed the incident from a he-said-she-said dispute into a documented act visible to the world. The psychological effect of the Seahawks was also undeniable. By hovering above, visible but not aggressive, the aircraft reminded the Chinese crew that every action was being watched and saved. It was a silent message. The U.S. Navy was prepared not only to resist physically, but also to win the information war. In modern conflicts, perception often carries as much weight as firepower, and the Seahawk turned the skies into a stage for strategic signaling. For the crew aboard the Higgins, the helicopter also served a practical function. Its sensors extended the destroyer's situational awareness, providing commanders with a comprehensive picture of the Chinese ship's readiness and posture. With cameras zooming in on radar dishes and exhaust vents, the Seahawk provided data that the ship's own radar could not. In a confrontation where seconds mattered, this expanded vision reduced uncertainty and bought critical reaction time. Every second of footage was streamed back to the Higgins and stored for intelligence review. These images could be shared with allies, presented to the United Nations, or shown to the American public if necessary. In an era where global opinion can shift quickly, having verifiable proof was as vital as having weapons ready to fire. By the time the Seahawk settled into its orbit, the encounter had escalated into more than just a close pass. It had become a carefully documented clash of will, carried out not with gunfire but with cameras, sensors, and discipline. The peak of tension arrived soon after, when the distance between steel hulls closed to an alarming threshold. The radar screen inside the USS Higgins Combat Information Center delivered the most alarming figure yet. The closest point of approach, or CPA, had fallen to only 150 yards. At a closing speed of over 25 knots, that meant less than 1 minute before the steel hulls of 2 modern destroyers could collide. For any naval officer, this is the nightmare scenario. At that distance, a single miscalculation or hesitation can transform a standoff into an international disaster. On the bridge, silence replaced words. Orders were precise, voices calm, but the weight of the situation pressed heavily on every crew member. Helm control maintained course, fire control teams plotted angles, and the Mark 45 gun remained visibly trained toward the Chinese vessel. Engines held steady, but every system stood at the edge of activation. The tension was not only physical, but also psychological, as both sides knew that a collision would not only sink steel, but also shatter stability in one of the world's most contested waterways. Inside the Chinese destroyer, intentions remained deliberately unclear. No radio calls, no lights, no warning signals, only speed and direction. To the American crew, this silence carried a stronger message than words. In naval terms, it was defiance, an attempt to force Washington to blink first. For Beijing, the gamble was calculated. Push close enough to intimidate, but stop just short of triggering open conflict. As the Seahawk helicopter orbited overhead, its infrared sensors continued to stream back images of Chinese sailors near the 130mm deck gun, standing still but visible. Every frame of video and every radar ping was being logged as evidence. This was not just about readiness for combat. It was about ensuring that if escalation occurred, the U.S. Navy could show the world who had acted responsibly and who had not. Seconds passed like hours. The CIC clock marked the countdown. 45 seconds to impact. 30 seconds. 25. The situation teetered on the edge of chaos. If either vessel failed to act, the outcome could have been catastrophic. Yet the USS Higgins held steady, embodying discipline and resolve. To veer away would risk legitimizing China's maneuver, creating a precedent for future harassment. To stand firm was dangerous, but it also reinforced the principle of lawful navigation through international waters. At the critical moment, the pressure broke. The Chinese Type 052D began to lose speed, dropping from 26 knots to 23 knots, then down to 21 knots. Its bow shifted slightly starboard, a turn so slight it might appear accidental, yet on radar it was unmistakable. The destroyer had yielded just enough to avoid a collision, though not sufficient to appear retreating. It was the classic gray zone move. Step back from disaster while still projecting strength. On the Higgins, the relief was palpable, yet silent. The ship had faced down a direct challenge without flinching. The collision course was avoided, but the confrontation was far from over. Both crews knew this was more than seamanship. It was strategy, played out in steel and silence. But the Chinese maneuver was not a retreat. It was the opening act of a carefully staged political performance. The silence finally broke, not with maneuver but with words. Moments after easing its bow starboard and reducing speed, the Chinese destroyer switched on its radio. The voice was flat, formal, and unmistakably scripted. U.S. Navy vessel, you are approaching in a Chinese-administered maritime zone. Alter your course immediately. Delivered without emotion, it was the exact language Beijing wanted recorded, a soundbite designed for both domestic propaganda and international ambiguity. On board the USS Higgins, the response came swiftly, measured yet firm. The officer of the deck keyed the mic and spoke in calm tones. This is a United States warship conducting legal passage in international waters. The words were chosen carefully, each one grounded in maritime law. There was no threat, no insult, only clarity. For Washington, the priority was not only to assert freedom of navigation, but also to ensure that every broadcast could withstand diplomatic scrutiny. In that moment, language itself became a weapon, as powerful as the 5-inch gun trained across the waves. The exchange lasted less than a minute, yet it carried weight far beyond the Taiwan Strait. China had framed the waters as its own, using the phrase Chinese administered, which implies both control and legitimacy. The US, by contrast, anchored its response in the principle of international waters, emphasizing the rights guaranteed under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, despite not having formally ratified it. Both sides were speaking past each other, not to achieve a resolution but to claim a narrative advantage. On deck, Chinese sailors could be seen gesturing with open palms and wide arms, a maritime signal meaning finished or we're done here. Yet their destroyer did not pull away. It continued to shadow the Higgins at a safe but deliberate distance. This was not a retreat, but a calculated pause. By remaining nearby, the Chinese vessel maintained pressure without crossing the threshold of escalation. The gesture reassured domestic audiences of resolve while allowing Beijing to avoid immediate confrontation. For the American crew, this moment revealed the true nature of gray zone tactics. The danger lay not in open conflict, but in the steady normalization of hazardous encounters. By staging these confrontations, China sought to test red lines, blur legal boundaries, and erode the US Navy's ability to operate without constant harassment. To walk away quietly would have signaled acceptance. To respond too aggressively could have sparked a wider crisis. In this delicate balance, words mattered as much as missiles. Every second of the radio dialogue and every gesture on deck was recorded by the Seahawk overhead, providing Washington with irrefutable evidence. These records would be critical in international forums, ensuring that China could not distort the encounter into a tale of American provocation. For the US, credibility in the global maritime order depended not just on strength, but on proof. What unfolded on the radio was not the end of the confrontation, but the unveiling of a larger strategy, a political game played as carefully as a naval maneuver. The confrontation in the Taiwan Strait was not a random clash, but part of Beijing's gray zone strategy. This doctrine avoids direct war while steadily challenging opponents, using close maneuvers and silent defiance to test boundaries. By doing so, China pushes rivals into difficult choices without firing a shot. Examples of this pattern are readily available. In the South China Sea, the British destroyer HMS Richmond was cut off by a Chinese frigate in a dangerous bow crossing. In the East China Sea, a Japanese P-1 patrol aircraft had to divert when a Chinese J-11 fighter closed in at an unsafe range. American ships have also faced harassment, with Chinese vessels shadowing and pressing them during freedom of navigation patrols. Each event, when viewed alone, may look like a minor incident, but together they reveal a deliberate effort to normalize aggression. The goal is straightforward: to turn risky behavior into a routine. If such encounters occur frequently enough, they no longer shock the international community, and outrage begins to subside. This allows Beijing to advance its territorial claims and demonstrate strength without incurring the costs of open conflict. It is a strategy of pressure and perception, rather than an open battle. The United States has chosen a different path. Ships like the USS Higgins are instructed to maintain their course, obey maritime law, and document everything. Radar frames, radio logs, and high-resolution imagery from Seahawk helicopters provide irrefutable proof. These records are not just for military use, but also for diplomacy, ensuring Washington can counter Beijing's narrative in international forums. By combining discipline with transparency, the U.S. defends both freedom of navigation and its credibility on the global stage. This is the heart of the gray zone contest. China pushes with constant tests, while the U.S. responds with law, evidence, and endurance. But as the pattern continues, the question grows: how long can patience last before more decisive action becomes inevitable? The encounter in the Taiwan Strait was more than a near collision. It was a test of resolve between two of the world's most powerful navies. China advanced with silence, speed, and gray zone tactics, while the United States responded with discipline, documentation, and a steady presence. Every radar pulse, every radio call, and every maneuver became part of a larger struggle to shape the narrative as much as the sea itself. In the end, the standoff ended without a shot, but its message was unmistakable. This contest is far from over, and the next move could set the tone for the entire region. Subscribe to Navy Elite for clear analysis of weapons, battles, and strategy that shape our world today.